Welcome to the South African Budget Review for 2016, and this time we look at the budget from a societal and a political perspective. This is a discussion which will look at the implications of the budget allocation on issues that face the society at large. I'm Nozipho Mbanjwa. I'm going to be hosting you for the next 30 minutes. Please also note that we will be hosting the youth panel discussion. That's coming up at the top of the hour, so please do join me for that particular discussion. Right now, though, let me introduce my guests. I'm joined in Johannesburg by Grathel Motau. She's development economist and business commentator. I'm also joined by Ralph Mathekga. He's a political analyst at Mistra, or the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. And I'm also joined by Ndaba, Ntsele, the president of the Black Business Council, and he joins us from Cape Town. But we kick off our conversation with a Skype conversation with Daniel Silke. He's a director at Political Futures Consultancy. Daniel, thank you for making the time to join us. From a political perspective, would you say that Minister Pravin Gordhan hit all the right political points in this budget?
Well, look, I think if you analyze the sentiment in the budget, if you analyze the areas covered in the budget, I think that he certainly mentioned them all. And in fact, he followed on Jacob Zuma's State of the Nation address in similar vein. The issue is, it's one thing to talk about the issues, it's another thing to implement, or at least to provide some sort of innovative new thinking. And I'm afraid to say that although I think he covered the bases in a solid performance, I didn't hear any killer blow in the budget that would have made it memorable to both domestic and foreign investors. And perhaps that's the problem that I had with it. Maybe expectations were too great, but I just feel as though the budget missed an opportunity to really, in a concrete way, a signal that South Africa was ready to change the way it does business.
But Daniel, one could counter and say that it might have been difficult for him to put anything bold on the table, given, of course, the fracas that we saw with the changing of the finance ministers in December, that possibly playing into what went into this particular budget. How would you react to that?
Well, you're right. I think there were substantial political constraints here on Pravin Gordhan to even suggest a different way of doing business in terms of changing policy tack, be it, for example, on part privatization of state-owned enterprises, for example. That would have been a very difficult one to sell to the ANC right now. And clearly the minister is mindful of the local government election campaign, a more fragile ANC, and the need to keep the ANC's constituency relatively happy. But that had to be balanced with the critical position that South Africa is in at the moment, the potential of a rating agency's downgrade, and the capital outflow that we've seen from this country over the last few months. And it was a balancing act and a tightrope indeed. But I just don't feel it did enough to really allay the fears, let us say, of domestic and foreign business interests.
Daniel, how would you describe Minister Pravin's demeanor as he delivered this particular address? Some voices are saying that he exuded a sense of, I'm the man in charge. I don't know if I agree with that. What's your view?
Well, I certainly think he's entered the scene once again in a very, very strong position. But when you listen to this particular budget, it almost felt as though that strong position that we all spoke about, it almost as though he had his hands tied to some degree in presenting the budget. So I think that there was a degree of confidence, there was a degree of saying, listen, I'm here and we're going to get this right. But when you read through the speech and you looked at the holes and the gaps and the deficiencies, it just didn't quite match the demeanor of the minister. And I think the public relations exercise was quite positive for government, but I think on further analysis, and I suspect the markets have spoken on that, they weren't that enthusiastic about what we heard.
Daniel Silke, independent political analyst, thank you for your insights. I'm pulling the conversation back to Johannesburg. Ralph, here are some descriptive words that came from Daniel. Holes, gaps, deficiencies, and missed opportunities. What's your word cloud?
Well, if there is such a thing as a defensive budget, I think this was quite a defensive budget. Government is coming on the back foot here. And I think that the minister was trying by all means not to offend anyone. He couldn't raise the tax, not only because of the economic constraint, but also because of the political constraint. You can't raise tax now when government has got legitimacy crisis when it comes to collecting revenue. The question will be that government is so wasteful. We just came from the Ngandla issue as it's going on. You just can't go to the personal income tax. Then what do? You start to tax sugar. There is no plan that I've seen that shows that government is aiming to target obesity. You can't go with tax first without having a comprehensive plan as to what result are you targeting.
In fact,
especially if it's a targeted tax.
NHI would perhaps be more important in terms of health indicators and health outcomes than sugar.
Exactly. For me, it doesn't work. I see National Treasury that is struggling to scrape in the bottom of the barrel to get revenue. They will tax just about anything that will not offend anyone. And I think on the sugar, they're going to offend people. But I also think that politically, there is these constraints. They're talking about privatization of, giving equity, minority equity into the state-owned. I can tell you now, COSATU is not going to like it. Just wait for COSATU to say that we don't want this, because government, as we speak, has got no clear legitimacy to actually engage in such kind of a transaction. You are likely to run into a situation where the state assets are given to interest groups and all that. The question is that you cannot do it now, and I think that this budget actually, it's not aggressive enough. The minister was not firm. Actually, as I was listening through the budget, there was a bit of misreading here and there. I saw the minister who's more nervous actually. I didn't see the comfort that people are talking about. I saw the minister who was careful, nervous, non-committal, somehow aiming only at restoring credibility with the business community. I don't know if it worked or not. The rand, how did it perform? 3% loss throughout the speech. I think it was a bad budget.
It was a bad budget on your part. I'll challenge you on the benchmarks of our reading standards in South Africa. That's a debate for another day. But Grathel, let me come to you, because Ralph has put the unions in the center of this conversation. But one would think that on the part of the pension reforms, for example, and delaying that by another 2 years, that would have been fantastic news. The recommitment to finding a solution to the minimum wage agreement, that would have been fantastic news. I would think that the unions are in their corner saying this was a fantastic budget.
You see, I think, there's one thing in talking and the implementation. And the minister kept on saying, I think he said a couple of times, that, words themselves are not enough. And I mean, talking about the pension fund reform, for example, he tried to, to say to the public servants to say, don't worry, actually the public investment fund, the public fund, the PSC is in good hands.
Yes.
In actual fact, if you look at the performance of the portfolio, this year it's increased by, I think he mentioned a percentage of 12.2%, taking it to 1.6 trillion rands in terms of the asset management. To say, really, you are in, your money is
But isn't that a bit far-fetched? If you are sitting, for example, as a teacher in one of the township schools, telling me about the performance of the PIC isn't really going to allay my fears about what actually happens to my pension. I'm just going to want to cash out.
Sure, that's a valid point.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's I think it's the comment that is coming through to say, the minister in his budget, who is he actually addressing? Is he addressing a man in the street?
Yes.
Or is he addressing the rating agencies?
Yes.
Or who is he really
And I think that's a valid point to segue us into to Cape Town. Mr. Ndaba Ntsele, let's bring you into this conversation. What did black business get out of this budget?
Look, first, when a company is doing bad, and then the CEO of that company must do what the minister did. He said he's going to monitor the government not to overspend. That is key for any company or government that is doing bad. So from that point of view, I think one is happy of what he said. But from moving forward, I mean, it talk about cutting costs and all that, but then what's going to help us, we need projection of growth. And he was not as brave as when he was talking about growth and also talking about meeting business in the country, that what is the big plan? And that is what is going to take our country forward. For controls, is given, we give him 10 out of 10, but he was very, very vague in terms of we've met big business, we talked to business, but what's going to happen with that? You know, it was not exactly science. Now, from a black business point of view, I think there are also some positive things regarding recapitalization, the Ministry of SMEs, we've discussed about that. But then, again, when you talk about black industrialists and putting people into the economy, we have to come with innovative funding structures, you know, like venture capital. And it was very silent about that because our DFIs and the private banks, their lending criteria is the same.
Absolutely, and I think that's an important point, questioning whether DFIs are the most relevant institutions when it comes to actually building black industrialists, and shouldn't we be looking at venture capitalists and the likes. CNBC Africa was on the ground in Cape Town and received this reaction from the opposition party, Julius Malema, who is, of course, the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters.
Well, the man tried his level best. He spoke to all constituencies. He gave business something. He gave assurance to investors and credit ratings. He gave something to the poor and the workers. And we are confident that all of us should appreciate the fact that we are going through a difficult time. And we need to put aside our ideological differences and our desire to maximize profit, even at a difficult time, and support this budget. So we think that we have to be behind Minister Gordhan. He's doing everything in his power because the top leadership has failed the country. And he's coming and saying to credit ratings and investors, there are still men and women in this country who are prepared to make this country work.
So of course nationalization was one thing he touched on. He said he's not falling to the P word. He's focusing on the first one. Do you agree with that?
But we're not happy. We are happy that he wants to merge Express with SAA. But introduction of private investment, we think, is a gradual introduction towards privatization. But he did mention and reassured us that he's not privatizing. But we are of a view that actually SAA with Express can be run successfully without private intervention. We just need men and women capable enough to run such complicated institutions. And we're going to be monitoring that very closely. Because I saw the DA clapping hands strongly, and I was saying, these neoliberals, if they clap hands, it looks like there's something towards the P word, and I have a problem with that. But I think that he means good. We will have to just monitor the process and ensure that state-owned enterprises, particularly the strategic ones, are not privatized, because that will undermine a developmental state.
Julius Malema, they're reminding us of the one swear word that does exist in corporate South Africa. It's called the P word, and it stands for privatization. And we'll talk about that in relation to state-owned enterprises in a second. But Ralph and Grathel, before we go there, Julius Malema reminds me, of course, of the fracas that we saw with the State of the Nation address. The question then becomes, did they not have the space to do that when it comes to budget, or was it a strategic and tactical decision not to disrupt the budget?
Well, I think that they might have exhausted that line of disruption in Parliament. But I also think that if you look at the political context against which Pravin Gordhan came back to Treasury, it almost favors them. I mean, they've removed someone that they thought, they've pressured for the removal of Des Van Rooyen, someone who was seen as a vehicle for patronage within Treasury. And I think that that is why there is a bit of a sigh of relief to try to give Pravin Gordhan some space. But I also think that they've also run out of ideas. I mean, let's be honest. Let's look at what the policymakers are actually saying about this. Maybe as a nation, we've just hit a dead wall. We just don't know. Genuinely so, we just don't have ideas to a point where we can even accept a budget such as this and say we want to give a space. What is the plan that actually came within this budget? There is a mentioning of Invest SA, no detail as to what needs to be done on that. It's when you look at this budget, you don't have a sense as to which direction the policies are going to go, what are the plans. I've heard some people saying that it is not the job of Treasury to come up with a plan. Then what is the basis of funding if you don't have a plan? It's supposed to be laid on top of a plan. I didn't see that.
Grathel, I think to just as a continuation of that point of quite a bit of fragmentation coming through, investors say a new partnership coming on board, DTI bringing to the fore a new investment promotion agency, which one would assume sits at the core of their existing mandate already. From that perspective, did you get a sense that what was communicated to South Africa and the international community now was a coherent plan, or was it a lot of bits and pieces thrown together in one basket?
You know what, I think I must say that really the minister had a very unenviable task to start with, and I think he tried within the limited constraints that are facing him. And I think he also mentioned the word frankness. We have to be frank about our challenges. We also have to be frank about our opportunities. And I think he, some of the words that he used, he mentioned the private sector a lot in his speech, which is what we've been talking about. The relationship and the partnership between the public sector and the private sector. But again, what is it? What is it about? What is this uncertainty in the mining sector that we're talking about? And he says that there are we are showing you that we are actually listening to the issue that the private sector is saying, but it's not very it's not very coherent. It's there and there, and I think it really follows from the State of the Nation's address, because if you recall, the State of the Nation's address was also all over. It had a bit of that, a bit of that, a bit of that, a bit of that. And I think he tried to say, there's two things that I need to focus on. I need to focus on economic growth, which are some of the things that he then looked at. He mentioned the IDC, for example, that it will be spending 100 billion over the next 5 years, but it's not new. If you look at the annual report of IDC, I think of 2 years ago, it was already there. Well, the only thing in that case, or in that instance, that was mentioned that is new in his budget is the Black Industrialist program.
And of course, also knowing that the IDC has been a champion of the Black Industrialist program, it's not something that's entirely new in terms of this budget, but something that has been in existence at least for 18 months now. Let me go back to Cape Town and come back to you, Ndaba. I want to touch on the issue of corruption. We've been told that there's going to be an e-tender portal, and again, this gives one the impression that we're moving towards an era of transparency around the allocation of tenders. Is this something that you see as a positive development and that could bode well for black business?
I didn't hear properly, but I just want I thought you talk about corruption.
Yes.
Which I must salute the minister. He talked about corruption, but what I want to make a point and give people hope in terms of this black industrialists. The minister flagged it, but on the ground, DTI and black business who are engaging, who are having a plan, the plan of action is there already, and some people don't have hope that will take place. And I just got to emphasize that there are black industrialists at this point in time that are manufacturing, that we are, or the government is going to enhance their businesses. So it's not all doom and gloom when it comes to putting blacks into the mainstream of the economy. And of course, a budget is a budget. It was putting things across. Now, South Africa or South Africans, we are the one that must make these things happen. A minister and a president, they give hope, but the real world, are we South Africans ready to do that? What was also quite disturbing, ironically for me, is the amount of social grants. It's actually ironical that we are going to spend a lot of money in social grant, But the flip side is that we're not creating entrepreneurs, people that can be self-sustainable. And we keep on increasing social grant. It's an irony, it's good that the government does this, but then at the same time, the time that we have people that are not getting a lot of social grants, it means South Africans are able to assist themselves using the government structures and we're creating employment for other people.
Ndaba,
because it must be us that must carry on.
Ndaba, let me jump in because I think you've made a very important point. I'm going to bring the issue of social grants to the discussion here in Johannesburg, but I do want to ask a controversial question. There's a view that each time the government speaks of black industrialists and black business, that what the unsaid is that this is part of an empowerment policy, and the bigger unsaid is that this potentially still breeds corruption. Just clarify for us how you are approaching that particular debate so that there's a very clear distinction between the creation of black industrialists and festering corruption between the public and the private sector.
You see, I don't want to dwell on rumors, but I can safely tell you that we are discussing with the government in good faith, and as an organization, the Black Business Council, we condemn corruption. We've been part of creation of this black industrialists in terms of what programs are we going to do, what type of funding are we going to do. And of course, I don't want to dwell into the perception that when you look at black people and you think that they're doing something that is corrupt. That's a myth that I don't believe in it. And then of course, there's also nothing wrong for black people to also look at a lot of government opportunity, because you know,
yes,
a budget speech, the minister says, I'm going to spend so much. That is real. So that money, it has to get into South African hands, because I can tell you some of the budget, like let's talk quickly about the infrastructure spent. Some of the money in the infrastructure spent by Minister Patel has gone back to white corporation, and some of them went overseas.
Yeah.
So we have to find, as Black Business Council, we're trying to find a mechanism that this money, at the end of the day, must also filter into black people in this country.
Well, thank you so much. And I think we've left this panel discussion on that controversial note. But certainly, these are the brave conversations that we need to have in South Africa. A very big thank you to my guests for joining me in this particular panel.